When a film becomes infamous for its poor quality, people are just expected to dislike it on principle. Thus, taking a more positive outlook to the film can lead to a depressing situation, where you might be waving the flag of noteworthy awesomeness for something and few give you heed. One of the most derided James Bond films is A View to a Kill. The last of Roger Moore's run, it weirdly serves as an appropriate coda for the man. Keeping the comedy high while injecting more contemporary elements seems to have been the key theme of the Moore era. Sometimes that worked wonderfully, but it can also incredibly date the project. I unfortunately have never been a fan of this one myself. It was always the Moore film I was least likely to want to watch, and I've often pegged it as my least favorite official Bond film. That sentence doesn't mean it doesn't have its features, and I can't understand people's admiration for it, but the math just doesn't equate to a positive sum for me here. I consider the film something of a transitional piece, putting forth a classic 007 yarn rooted in the formula of the past, while also making a case for why Bond is still ahead of the curve and at the forefront of contemporary action cinema. This arguably has been the goal for all of the Bond films, but it's a risky balancing act that requires some careful consideration before embarking on that road. A View to a Kill tries to walk this tightrope, but whenever the producers start to become complacent of their success, the succeeding films become half-hearted, and View is definitely a victim of this cycle. James Bond brings back a microchip from the body of 003 in Siberia to England. Q analyzes it and points out that it is exactly the same as a brand of microchips from Zorin Industries, suggesting that the Russians have a pipeline into a Western corporation and are capable of making chips that can withstand nuclear blasts. Bond suggests looking into Max Zorin himself, given that the leak occurred after Zorin purchased the company who manufactured the chips. Upon an initial investigation, Bond finds that Zorin is involved in many suspicious ventures, but none more so than the oil industry in the San Francisco Bay Area. Traveling to California, Bond meets up with Stacy Sutton, an oil heiress and geologist who is putting Zorin through a long legal battle. The two begin to investigate further into Zorin's activities, uncovering a horrifying plan meant to secure a monopoly on the microchip industry at the expense of the devastating destruction of Silicon Valley, the heartland of electronic production in the United States. In 1985, Cubby Broccoli was quoted as saying, "Let's face it, there's a sameness about James Bond that you can't escape." Roger Moore expressed a similar sentiment that year in an interview. It's exactly the same as a child wanting to hear a bedtime story, and if you change a word or leave out a few lines because you think he's fallen asleep, or you're bored and you want to get off to bed yourself, look out. We want the comfort of sameness. I think no Bond film better encapsulates the arguments for and against sameness than A View to a Kill. The movie overall isn't doing much unique, much like I commented on with Octopussy. But unlike that film, there's a lethargic and passive sense to the execution a lot of the time. View makes me the most aware of the formula while I'm watching it, which is honestly fine. Not that I don't appreciate variety, but I'm the guy who usually orders the same meal I got last time at a Thai place. I like what I like, and as long as you're making the meal well, I have little qualms about it. But other than a few elements, there's little that gets me excited about the majority of this one. Its story does come together, but it seems so divergent in its bridges between the subplots that I often scratch my head trying to connect the dots. Roger's performance is still consistently fine, but the shtick is getting old, and however you rationalize the man's age away, it becomes a problem here in ways that it wasn't in earlier installments. The main woman is notorious amongst fans, and I've never had a single viewing where she hasn't been a primary issue. Most of the action scenes do nothing for me, and a lot of the individual connecting scenes feel unenthusiastic or uninteresting. The result is a film that fails in trying to make a case for why the old ways work best, and instead becomes a resounding pronouncement on the need to introduce new blood to the series. Roger Moore has done so much to keep Bond alive in the minds and hearts of fans, but even he can't escape the rising tide of time, and he was often the first one to point that out. Ever since the release of Moonraker, Moore had been toying with the idea of leaving the series. Yet I'm surprised how easy it was to get him to come back for a seventh film when he chose to accept the Octopussy assignment at the 11th hour. If he was so uncertain in 1982, I'm not sure why he didn't have similar feelings with this one. It doesn't help much that the production seems to be highlighting his age in a way that they haven't before. The goons are noticeably older, the wardrobe isn't quite as fitting, almost all the women remain in the perpetual state of peak physical beauty while the men noticeably age. There's a heavier emphasis on action scenes that downplay Bond's physicality, the poor hiding of the stunt doubles, and so on. By putting a spotlight on him like that, it jolts me out of the experience because I'm not allowed to get lost in the fantasy of the film. Roger isn't doing a lot wrong with the part, and he's still fun as long as you were already on board with him for previous films. That said, it does feel like it's time to move on, and I'm in the camp that feels Roger should have left after Octopussy. At this point, saying Tanya Roberts' Stacey Sutton is one of the least of the Bond women feels like saying Desmond Llewellyn is the best Q. You might have a different opinion, but the sentiment is expressed so often within the community that it can feel like wasted breath. The constant screams, the obliviousness she displays towards her situation at times, the fact that she rarely shows a moment of strength and determination on her own except in the finale, it's exhausting. I've never cared for this character, despite some nice groundwork laid for the part. I like that she could have just been left an oil heiress, but she decided to become a geologist and give Zorin a hard time legally. But that's about it with my positives. Even the other weaker Bond women don't actively drag down a film for me, and thus Stacey is an easy pick for my least favorite of that category. I spend a lot of my time with her just wishing she would leave the film and just let Bond go solo for this one. Thankfully, we have a couple of great villains here. Christopher Walken is one of those actors with a large cult following, much like Nicolas Cage or Jeff Goldblum, and so his casting initially seems like an odd choice given that he's following on from people like Louis Jourdan or Michael Lonsdale. However, this oddness is quickly forgotten about when you see how much fun Walken is having with Max Zorin. He has a presence about him and a mastery of delivering barbed wire dialogue. You can tell there's a darkness behind his delivery of the lines, but physically he betrays nothing about his villainy. Plus, he really does embody the craziness his backstory lays out. The odd laughs, the maniacal stares, his willingness to bump off people on a whim, it adds up to the best villain we've seen since Scaramanga, and arguably is even better. The choice to have him execute almost everyone in the mine may seem excessive in its violence. Even Moore and Walken were uncomfortable with it, but I adore that we have a moment like this. I complained with Never Say Never Again that Largo never had a moment to show off his brand of craziness, and I'm glad to be covering a film immediately afterwards that is a great example of what I was talking about. Plus, as long as the authorities don't look too closely at some of the bodies with bullet holes in them, having everyone perish in the flooding helps to sell the idea that the destruction of Silicon Valley was an accident resulting from natural causes. It's amusing to me that the weaker two Moore films happen to have some of the best villains, and it further fuels my point that no Bond film is without merit. Grace Jones' Mayday is also iconic. She's got such a striking profile, is often the first to jump into the action, and is a woman of few words. Yet she has an independence about herself that helps to sell her turn at the end. By the way, I feel like Mayday's betrayal works so much better than Jaws' at the end of Moonraker. She's got hard evidence that Zorin never cared about her, and as a scorned lover, she knows the biggest FU she can pull off is to ruin his grand scheme. Almost gleeful about the irony of the situation, she then immediately shows a stone-cold face when she sees Zorin's blimp just before her death. I love everything about this. It's an excellent character beat. I'm not too crazy about the other villains, though, and that's okay given the shining beacons of light we just covered. Scarpine is fine, I guess, but he just seems secondary to Mayday, and given how effective she is at her job, I'm not sure that he's really that necessary to have around, though I'm glad Zorin has more than one loyal henchman. Carl Mortner is a fun idea, helping to add legitimacy to Zorin's madness, though I wish he wasn't quite as stereotypical a mad scientist in his profile. Alison Doody, best known for her turn as Elsa Schneider in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, has an early part as Jenny Flex. But while she and Papillon Soso's Pan Ho are often in the background of various scenes, they're just heavies, and so there's nothing to get excited or disappointed about them. The rest of the supporting cast is fine. Patrick Macnee is a delight as Sir Godfrey Tibbett. Highlights include his great chemistry with Roger throughout, and the fact that he's an active part of the investigation, often going off on his own accord to help out. McNee is a great character actor who I've seen in a number of things, most notably the Avengers TV show from the 1960s, a show that is responsible for giving us quite a few great people to the Bond series, by the way, and he is sorely missed when he's killed off. When Bond discovers his body, Moore gets to express one of my favorite minor character traits of Bond. He is respectful to those that have just passed on and takes a moment to acknowledge that. David Hipp, yet another Indiana Jones veteran, plays Felix Leiter substitute Chuck Lee. He's fine in the part, but his death is pretty unceremonious and he doesn't get that much to do. As a side note, I don't just call him a Leiter substitute just because he comes from the CIA. That is who initially was supposed to be here, but in order to capitalize on the Asian community within San Francisco, and I suspect partly because the character dies later on, the part was changed. The MI6 regulars are pretty much what you'd expect, though along with Moore, I feel Lois Maxwell's age here more than in any other installment. I do love that she gets to get out of the office for a bit, though I must admit, the My Fair Lady reference is pretty unfunny. Gogol's presence is a bit wasted in the film, though I like the idea of the main villain being a renegade KGB agent. Pola Ivanova is an okay part of the film, though given her groan-worthy Tchaikovsky line and how she blips in and out of the story, I'm actually glad that this was a new character rather than a returning Anya Amasova as was originally planned. By the way, why do the Bond films seem to have such horrible luck with getting returning cast members? This has happened several times where they hope to get someone back, the person will end up declining or is unavailable, and they basically cross out the name of the character and change it to someone else without drastically making it a different person, thus making the obvious substitution even more obvious. Finally, it's fun to see future action star Dolph Lundgren, then boyfriend of Grace Jones, get a small cameo. This is the same year the man got his breakout role of Ivan Drago in Rocky IV, and it's an instant reminder of the time period in which this film was made. This is easily my least favorite of John Glenn's 5 Bond films. It just doesn't have the sense of groundedness that his best efforts have, and it's not as fun as Octopussy. Bond still relies less on gadgets here, but that direction isn't accompanied with the stronger focus on character that his other films have. Plus, there's no pigeon jump scare. The outright comedic bits of the film constantly leave me bewildered like I'm being hit with a brick. Seriously, I'm not sure I can quite articulate why the Union Jack being on Bond's parachute in The Spy Who Loved Me works, but that same symbol on Bond's ice submarine feels like it's from Austin Powers. So much of the films feels stretched out without some strong connecting through lines. Bond initially starts with trying to investigate the company because of a microchip leak, though that is immediately put into the background so that we can deal with horse steroids, which really has nothing to do with the story other than to demonstrate that every aspect of Zoran's operations are shady. We then leave that behind entirely to deal with the oil wells being replaced with seawater, which eventually leads to flooding Silicon Valley along with enacting an earthquake that is destroying part of the San Andreas Fault. It's quite a stretch throughout, and while I'm glad they eventually worked the well activity back into the main plot, it does seem wholly unrelated to the scheme until Sutton fills in the blanks later. So I'm not sure why Bond in the moment thinks this is worthy of investigation. Though I suppose he's following the only leads he has, N.S. Sutton in America and Bob Connolly's reference to the oil interests in California. The film does fill in the blanks eventually, but it feels like Bond has read the script and is one step ahead of us. He knows where he has to be in order to propel the story forward, rather than the story feeling a bit more natural in its investigation. As much as I threw shade at Golden Gun for shifting back and forth between two seemingly unrelated plots, I could still follow that through line better than this one. The rest of the production is pretty much a lateral step from the last 2 films. It has the same high and low points. The sets are fine, the stunt work is solid, the music has a few bangers, and there's some excellent miniature and special effects works, mixed in with some bad rear projection shots and the hilariously bad dummies. The action, unfortunately, takes a general step down. I don't care for the fire truck chase, with another instance of comedic cops. The fight at Stacy's house just passes by without much fanfare, though I love the gag with the gun. The horse race is okay, and the fight in the warehouse is one of my least favorite instances of Bond fighting some goons. There are still a few high points. I like most of the skiing action and how it transitions from skis to snowmobile and then to snowboarding. However, I have the same problem with it that everyone else does. That stupid song. It is ridiculous and makes the scene an insipid joke. The car chase through Paris is neat. featuring great stunt work from Remy Julien's driving team, and the idea of Bond's car being chopped up is great. By far, the best action sequence in the film is the Golden Gate Bridge. The setup to this is pretty clunky. How long can Bond hold onto the mooring rope, and how much chalk does he have coming out of those hands? But the actual scene is inspired. Using a combination of miniatures, rear projection, studio work, and actual footage from the bridge, it's the most energetic part of the movie, complete with John Barry's great action piece. Even though the rear projection shots are dodgy, I still feel a great amount of tension while watching this, and I'm fully invested in the moment. Well done, folks. I can't pass up the opportunity to talk a little about the music. I'm mostly on the same page with everyone else about Duran Duran's title song. The lyrics make no sense, but it's so catchy and filled with such a life that the rest of the film is lacking that it stands out. It was the last song Duran Duran did as a group before they split up the first time, and it stands as a fan favorite. I only wish Maurice Binder's title sequence accompanying it was a bit better. There are undoubtedly some great images here, but much of it feels awkward and poorly lit to me. The actual score by John Barry is fine, though I've never understood how some people put the entire score as one of the best in the series. The best pieces are the instrumental versions of the title song, and a stellar action piece that gets constant reuse throughout the film. But beyond that, there are a few pieces or sections that I can recall. I don't think Barry ever did a bad Bond score, but this is not one of his best efforts. The film ended up being a bit of a swan song for several key people in the Bond series. Obviously, this was Roger Moore's final Bond film, as well as Lois Maxwell. However, several key people ended their tenure with Bond here, like cinematographer Alan Hume, who had done the last two Bond films and had also done Return of the Jedi. Martin Grace, one of the great stunt people in the business, also left. He narrowly escaped death on Octopussy and had done work as far back as You Only Live Twice. Willie Bogner Jr. makes his fourth and final effort for the ski sequence here, but the biggest blow to me is Bob Simmons. His contribution to the series is legendary, having done work on all but 3 official Bond films up until 1985, including standing in for Sean Connery during the first gun barrel of the series. The Bond films almost always achieve top marks in their stunt work for me, and Bob was the man who paved the way for all to follow. A View to a Kill overall is not a film that inspires much confidence in the future of the series. The modern influence jars with the routine elements, making the film feel both anachronistic and yet entirely of the time. Either way, the movie feels dated in a way that few Bond entries do. If you have an affinity for the mid-1980s, I imagine you're far kinder to this film than the majority of fans, and I can't blame you. However, I don't, and despite the film's more alluring qualities, it remains as one of my least favorites. I do think I've been too rough on this one in the past. It's a better Bond film than its critics have made it out to be, but given the company of films it belongs to, it does inevitably shift towards the lower end of the rankings. Professional critics have always been quite harsh on this film. It stands as the lowest rated of the official films on Rotten Tomatoes, and box office-wise it earned less money than its predecessors, though still enough to be qualified as success. The Bond series is one of the longest lasting in film history, and that sameness of the formula that I talked about earlier is part of the reason why. Much like the Legend of Zelda or Mario series in video games, the individual entries don't vary wildly from each other that much, but there's still nothing quite like a genuine Bond film when it achieves its objectives. I love this series wholeheartedly, and I'll happily put in an official Bond film before I switch on most any other film. But every series has its low points, and I put A View to a Kill squarely in my personal bracket of that distinction. I still enjoy discussing the merits of the film with its fans, but the deficits are enough to turn me away from it most of the time, and it's rarely even in my top 15 choices of films to rewatch from the series. The filmmakers were definitely feeling the need to shake some things up, and with Roger finally departing from the role, the time felt right to usher in the 4th Bond actor, and hopefully re-energize the series for a new generation. When I think of Roger Moore, I have nothing but respect and admiration for the man. He took over the role when the series seemed to be at its most dire, and he had to win the whole world over. If he had failed, the Bond series would have quickly faded out, and it likely would have been amongst the likes of the Pink Panther series or the Harry Palmer series, icons of the 60s but whose flame was extinguished soon into succeeding decades. Thankfully, Roger made a case for a different type of Bond than what Sean had pioneered, and many of us were welcoming to that offering. It did stick around for too long, and some of the more outings are amongst the most criticized of the series. But anyone who can help someone get over the huge heartbreak of a first love's departure is doing something right, and Roger should be honored for his efforts. Plus, the man has become one of the most steadfast ambassadors for the series. Many of the Bond actors have expressed a reluctance to talk about their time, often coding interviews with feelings of embarrassment or resentment. Not Roger, though. He came in on his own terms, he left on his own terms, and he had great fun while doing it. He makes a lot of self-deprecating jokes, and he was often in good spirits when talking about the series, whatever his personal feelings were. He thought of the films as, quote, damn good entertainment, and he put in a lot of work to make them as such. Many younger fans tend to think of him as a clown in the role, and I can certainly see why that sentiment is shared. However, I would argue that Roger did take the role seriously throughout. Look at something like Moonraker or Octopussy. Despite the craziness surrounding him, his Bond always stuck to the mission, and he plays it with a sense of verisimilitude. The work doesn't faze our leading man, and thus it's easier to go along with the antics. My big problem with Roger's era, though, is that the man never felt much like a human being. I've always preferred the films to have a sense of grounded reality to their ridiculous fantasies, and to have a man at the center who can make mistakes and be hurt. It's mostly personal taste that makes me lean towards some of the other actors, though that's not to say that one take is inherently better than the other. Way back in my initial Bond ranking video, I mentioned a litmus test amongst fans that helped you peg which films they tend to like. To refresh your memory, which Bond film is better, From Russia with Love or Goldfinger? If you like Goldfinger more, chances are that you lean towards more of Roger's films. If you like Russia, you'll probably gravitate towards the lower-key adventures with more espionage and a down-to-earth feel like Casino Royale or The Living Daylights. Let me make it clear, neither is the right choice or is inherently filled with better films, it's just an inclination. And I happen to fall on the side that steers me away from Roger's films. I still highly enjoy a lot of them, and I definitely have a few to recommend to anyone who is curious. Yet, in a series of 25 official films, it's understandable if not all are of the same caliber. Roger's never been my favorite Bond, but I rejoice in the good work that he did, and he does bring a smile to my face, even if sometimes that smile is because of some of his film's more notorious aspects.